The silk was the color of a day that had given up on sunshine. Not black, not the stark declaration of fresh grief, but a soft, deep dove gray that drank the light and gave none of it back. Eleanor ran a finger over the bodice, the fabric cool and unforgiving beneath her touch. It was a beautiful gown, exquisitely made, the kind of dress she had only ever helped her cousins into, her own fingers nimble on the hooks and eyes of their jewel-toned silks. This one was for her a gift. Or so they had called it. Oh, it is perfect. Eleanor, our cousin Lavinia, had trilled that morning, holding it up against her. Lavinia, all vibrant rose pink and sunny blonde hair, made the gray dress look like a gathering storm cloud, so very elegant. So subtle. Tay. It suits you, her other cousin, Cecily had added, her eyes, sharp as little blue chips of glass, meeting Eleanor's in the mirror. A quiet girl needs a quiet color. The words had hung in the air, a silken little noose. Now, hours later, as she stood on the edge of the Duke of Harrowmere's sprawling lawns, the phrase echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. The garden party was a riot of life, a painter's palette gone mad with joy. Ladies drifted across the grass, in gowns the color of lemon curd and Robin's eggs and blushing peonies. Their laughter was a bright, tinkling sound, like champagne poured into crystal. And she, Eleanor Ashworth, was a smudge of charcoal on a watercolor painting, a single stark note of sorrow in a symphony of celebration. Her cousins had, of course, already abandoned her. They had deposited her by a marble fountain, as if she were a parcel they were tired of carrying, and had immediately been swallowed by a wave of fashionable acquaintances, their own gowns of apricot and lilac melting into the cheerful crowd. They had done their duty. They had brought the poor relation. Now, they could forget her. It was a cruelty so finely crafted. It was almost a work of art. To dress her for a party in the colors of polite mourning, ensuring she would be both present and invisible, a walking reminder of all that was somber and out of place. It was a punishment for the crime of existing, of being a financial burden their father had saddled them with, after her own had died, leaving nothing but debts, and a daughter with too much education and not enough dowry. Eleanor smoothed the hand down her gray skirts, her fingers catching on the fine weave. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. She would not hide in the orangery, or plead a headache, and beg a footman to find her a quiet room. She had learned long ago that the only way to endure humiliation was to stand quite still within it, to let it wash over you like cold water, and to remember that it, like all things, would eventually pass. So she stood, her back straight, her chin lifted just so, and pretended to be fascinated by the play of light on the water bubbling from the cupida's mouth. You must understand, child, that there are many kinds of prisons. Some have bars of iron, and some have bars of silk and obligation. Eleanor's was the latter, and in some ways, it was the more secure. She was trapped by gratitude, by the roof over her head and the food on her plate, and the price of it was to be a mirror in which her cousins could see themselves as beautiful and generous. She focused on the roses bordering the fountain, their petals a deep, velvety crimson. She catalogued the different shades, the way the sun warmed the outer petals to a brighter red, while the hearts remained a dark, secret wine. It was a trick she had learned. When the world of people became too sharp, she could lose herself in the world of things, of details, of textures and colors that asked nothing of her. A hush fell over the group nearest to her, a subtle shift in the current of conversation. The laughter did not stop, but it changed its pitch, becoming more conscious, more aware. Eleanor did not need to look up to know the cause. The host had appeared, Duke Alexander of Harrowmere. She had seen him only from a distance before, a remote and imposing figure in black broadcloth, his presence silencing rooms and turning heads. The county was full of stories about him. A widower, his beautiful young duchess, taken by a fever 2 years ago. A recluse, some said, frozen by grief. A cold man, Others whispered, who had inherited a title too young and a heart too old. He was the most powerful man in 3 counties, and the loneliest. Eleanor risked a glance from beneath the brim of her simple bonnet. He was moving along the edge of the lawn, inclining his head to a curtsying matron, offering a spare word to a puffed-up squire. He was dressed, as always, in dark impeccable tailoring that seemed to absorb the summer sunlight rather than reflect it. His face was starkly handsome, all clean lines and severe angles, his dark hair showing no hint of powder. But it was his eyes that held the attention. They were a cool, clear gray, the color of the North Sea in winter, and they seemed to miss nothing. He noticed the way Lady Danvers's fan fluttered a little too quickly, betraying her nerves. He noticed the way young Lord Ashworth's smile did not quite reach his eyes as he boasted of his new hunter. He noticed the competitive glint in the eyes of 2 mothers whose daughters were dressed in nearly identical shades of pink. He saw the whole glittering, frantic performance for what it was, and it bored him. His gaze swept onward, over the sea of bright silks and nodding plumes, and then it stopped. It stopped on her. On the quiet figure, in the quiet color, standing by the fountain, as if she had grown there. Eleanor felt the weight of his attention, like a physical touch, a pressure on her skin. She saw his eyes narrow slightly, a flicker of awe, something, not pity, not curiosity. Precisely. It was a look of assessment, of recognition, as if he had been scanning a page of familiar text and had suddenly found a word he did not expect. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The Duke of Harrowmere stood motionless, his attention fixed on the poor relation in the mourning dress. The ladies nearest him faltered in their chatter following his line of sight. Whispers started, little rustles of silk and speculation. Who was she? Why was he looking at her? Then, with a deliberation that felt as momentous as the signing of a treaty, he began to walk. He walked past the eagerly smiling Miss Albright, whose dowry was the talk of the season. He bypassed the witty and beautiful Lady Helen, who had made it plain she was interested in becoming the next Duchess of Harrowmere. He moved through the crowd as if parting water, his path straight, his purpose clear. He was walking directly toward Eleanor. Her heart, which she had commanded to be still and quiet, gave a sudden, painful lurch. This was a new and terrifying sort of attention. It was one thing to be ignored. It was another entirely to be singled out by the sun itself. She felt 100 pairs of eyes turned to her, sharp with surprise and dawning malice. She could feel her cousin's furious stare from across the lawn. She wanted to run. She wanted the marble of the fountain to open up and swallow her whole, but she was rooted to the spot, held fast by his unwavering approach. He stopped a few feet from her. The scent of damp earth and roses seemed to rise around them, creating a small, quiet island in the middle of the party. Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and resonant, with no more warmth than his expression. He knew her name. How did he know her name? She sank into a curtsy, her movements fluid from years of practice. Your Grace, you seemed to have been abandoned. It was not a question, but a flat statement of fact. Eleanor rose, keeping her eyes on a point somewhere just past his shoulder. My cousins are renewing their acquaintance with friends. Your Grace, I am content. Are you? He took a step closer, and she was forced to meet his gaze. Those gray eyes were unnervingly direct. You do not look content. You look patient, as if you are waiting for a storm to pass. The accuracy of the observation stole her breath. He saw. In one glance, he had seen past the placid mask she presented to the world, and had glimpsed the truth of her endurance. It was more terrifying than any insult. Storms are a part of nature, Your Grace, she managed, her voice a little unsteady. One learns not to fight them. A flicker of something. Was it amusement? Respect? Moved in the depths of his eyes. A stoic philosophy. And a lonely one. He looked around at the vibrant, chattering crowd, then back at her. I find myself in need of a respite from this relentless cheerfulness. "Would you do me the honor of walking with me, Miss Ashworth?" It was not a request, it was a command, wrapped in the thinnest veneer of courtesy. But it was also, she realized, with a dizzying shock, a rescue. He was plucking her from her isolation, from the slow public humiliation her cousins had designed, but in doing so, he was painting a much larger target on her back. She could refuse. She could murmur an excuse, plead a sudden faintness. It would be the safe thing to do, but as she looked at him, at the profound, unshakable loneliness in his own gaze that seemed to recognize the shape of her own, she found she did not want to be safe. She was tired of being safe in her small, gray world. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. He offered her his arm. The fine black wool of his coat was warm beneath her gloved fingers. As she laid her hand on his sleeve, a tremor of shock went through the assembled party, a collective gasp that was almost audible. The Duke of Harrowmere, who had not offered his arm to an unmarried woman since his wife's death, was now strolling into the gardens with the little gray mouse nobody had even noticed was there. Eleanor kept her head high as they walked away from the fountain, away from the whispers and the stares. She could feel her Kazinsa fury like a physical heat on her back. She did not look at them. She looked ahead, at the winding path that led into the heart of the Duca's famous gardens, and felt the world tilt on its axis. The air grew cooler as they moved away from the open lawns, the sounds of the party fading behind them, replaced by the gentle buzz of bees and the rustle of leaves. The Duke did not speak at first, and Eleanor was grateful for the silence. It gave her a moment to calm the frantic beating of her heart, to reassemble the composure that his sudden appearance had shattered. They walked along a path bordered by towering delphiniums, their blue spires stark against the ancient brick of a garden wall. He moved with an easy, ground-covering stride that she had to hurry slightly to match. He seemed entirely at ease in the quiet, as if this were his natural element. "And the party a foreign country he was forced to visit. My apologies if I caused you any discomfort, Miss Ashworth," he said at last, his voice startlingly close in the stillness. "You gave me no discomfort, Your Grace," she replied. It was not entirely true. Her discomfort was immense, but he was not the cause of it. "You offered me a kindness. Did I?" He glanced down at her, a wry, almost invisible twist to his lips. "My actions are not often interpreted as kind. Formidable, perhaps. Necessary. But rarely kind. Perhaps the interpretation depends on the recipient," Eleanor said, surprised at her own boldness. For someone standing in the rain, an umbrella is a kindness. No matter the motives of the man holding it, he was silent for a long moment. She feared she had overstepped, that her little analogy had sounded impertinent. Men like the Duke of Harrowmere were not accustomed to gentlewomen with opinions. A poor gentlewoman with opinions was a luxury no household could afford. But when he spoke, his voice held a new note, a genuine curiosity. "And you are standing in the rain? The social equivalent of it," she said simply. There was no point in lying to a man who saw so much. "My dress is not in keeping with the gaiety of the occasion. It is the color of a northern sky. Before snow," he observed, his gaze resting on her sleeve. "It is a color of honesty. In a garden full of flowers screaming for attention, it is restful." He paused, his eyes lifting to her face. But it was not your choice." Another statement of fact. Her breath caught. "Our girl is too plain for pink. It will only make her look sallow. A quiet girl needs a quiet color." She swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "It was a gift from my cousins," she said, her voice meticulously neutral. He needed no further explanation. He simply nodded, a brief, sharp movement of his head, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He knew the shape of cruelty, dressed as charity. He saw it all, the casual viciousness, the public stage, the deliberate isolation, and he had chosen to intervene. He steered them down a less traveled path, Where moss grew between the flagstones and the planting was wilder, more natural. He seemed to be leading them somewhere specific. The path opened out into a small, enclosed garden, almost a secret room, walled on three sides by dark, clipped yew hedges. In the center was a stone bench, and all around it grew a profusion of roses, white roses. They were beautiful, but the small garden had an air of slight neglect. A few of the bushes were overgrown, and weeds pushed up bravely around their bases. It was a place that had once been loved, and was now only remembered. "Am I late, Weisgarden?" he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He did not look at the roses, but at Eleanor's face, watching her reaction. The air was heavy with their scent, a sweet, almost melancholy perfume. Eleanor's heart ached for the woman she had never known, and for the man who stood beside her, his grief so immense it had become a wall around him. She looked at the roses, their petals, like white silk, some still perfect, others browning at the edges, touched by blight. She reached out, her fingers hesitating before gently touching the petal of a perfect, half-open bud. It was cool and soft, like a bioskin. They are beautiful," she whispered. But they look thirsty." She had said the wrong thing. She knew it instantly. It was an accusation of neglect, a criticism of his stewardship of this sacred place. She pulled her hand back as if burned. Beg your pardon, Your Grace. That was presumptuous." But Alexander was not looking at her with anger. He was looking at her hand, which had touched the rose with such unconscious tenderness. He was looking at her face, which was filled, not with morbid curiosity, but with a simple, honest sympathy for the flowers themselves. It was not presumptuous," he said slowly. It was the truth. "I have not set foot in this part of the garden for 2 years." He finally looked at the roses, his expression unreadable. The head gardener has his instructions, but a garden needs more than instructions to thrive. It needs attention. He turned his gaze back to her. As I suspect. Do people. A rustle of silk from the entrance to the little garden made them both turn. Lavinia and Cecily stood there, their faces flushed, their smiles stretched tight with false concern. Eleanor, there you are," Lavinia cried, her voice pitched high and bright. "We were so worried. You disappeared." She did not disappear, Lady Lavinia," the Duke said, his voice dropping to a temperature that could have frozen the fountain solid. She was with me." Of course, Your Grace," Cecily stammered, curtsying low. "She is not used to such attention." The implication was clear. She was not worthy of it. Alexander looked from their bright, predatory faces to Eleanor's calm, pale one. He saw the flicker of anxiety she could not quite hide, and the rigid control she exerted to keep her expression placid. He saw the proprietary way her cousins flanked the entrance, as if she were an errant possession they had come to reclaim. Your concern is noted," he said, his tone dismissing them utterly. Miss Ashworth was kind enough to offer me her company. I have not yet had my fill of it." He turned his back on them, a gesture of supreme and deliberate dismissal, and indicated the stone bench to Eleanor. Please. Sit." The cousins were left standing, their mouths slightly agape, their social artillery rendered useless against the granite wall of his authority. They exchanged a look of pure venom, then, with stiff curtsies they could not have imagined he saw, they retreated. Eleanor sat, her knees feeling weak. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her, publicly, against the claims of her own family. He had chosen her side. He did not sit beside her, but remained standing, looking out over the white roses. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with unspoken things, with the weight of his grief and her gratitude, and the startling unexpected spark of connection that had flared between two lonely people in a garden full of strangers. Miss Ashworth," he began, turning to face her. His expression was serious, the fleeting warmth gone, replaced by a kind of focused intensity. "I have a proposition for you Eleonora's mind went blank. A proposition. What could the Duke of Harrowmere possibly want with her? Her, a penniless relation in a borrowed grey dress. I find myself in a difficulty, he continued, choosing his words with care. A domestic difficulty of some delicacy. He paused, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to gauge her strength, her discretion. Alice. She is 7 years old and, Eleanor nodded, remembering the whispers. The Duca's child, a little ghost in the grand empty house, since her mother's death, he went on, his voice tight. Alice has not spoken a word. The simple sentence landed with the force of a physical blow. A 7-year-old child, silenced by grief, Eleanor's heart twisted, with a pain that was sharp and immediate. Oh, we have had doctors, specialists from London. We have had 3 governesses, all highly recommended, all of whom left within a month, declaring her stubborn and willful. They tried to force her to speak, to play, to be the child she was before. They filled the nursery with noise and forced cheerfulness. They drove her further into her silence. He began to pace the small space in front of the bench, his hands clasped behind his back. She is not stubborn, she is lost. And I do not know how to find her. I am a stranger in my own house, a stranger to my own child. The confession was raw, torn from him. Men do not always care to be seen, and dukes are the most private of all. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes pleading. Oh, when I saw you today, standing alone, you were not fighting your circumstances, you were enduring them, with a stillness I have not seen in anyone. When you looked at my wife as roses, you did not see death, you saw neglect, you saw thirst. He took a breath. I am not asking you to be a governess, Miss Ashworth. I am not asking you to teach her or to cure her. I am asking you to come to Harrowmere as a companion to my daughter, to sit with her in the silence, to be a quiet presence in a house that has become too loud with grief. Quote, to simply be there. It was the most extraordinary proposal she had ever heard. He was not offering her charity. He was offering her a purpose. He was not offering her a position she was unqualified for, but one for which her entire life of quiet observation and patient endurance had uniquely prepared her. He was offering her an escape from her cousins, from the daily humiliations and the suffocating weight of their generosity. He was offering her a home, or something like it. She should have felt a rush of triumphant joy. But instead, a cold knot of caution formed in her stomach. She had been a pawn in her cousin-saw games for too long to trust such a sudden reversal of fortune. She had learned the hard way that every gift has a price. She stood up, facing him. She was a small woman in a plain grey dress, and he was the Duke of Harrowmere, but in that moment, in that quiet garden, she felt his equal. Before I can answer, Your Grace, she said, her voice low, but steady. You must understand my conditions. His eyebrows shot up. It was an expression of pure surprise. He was a man who gave terms, not one who received them. But he did not speak. He simply waited, watching her. If I come to Harrowmere, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching, I will not be treated as a servant. I will have authority in the nursery, second only to your own. The staff will answer to me in all matters concerning Alice. He nodded slowly. That is reasonable. I will not be expected to perform affection for you or for the child. Whatever trust I earn from her will be earned, honestly, in its own time. I will not lie to her, and I will not force her. I would expect nothing less. He said, his voice quiet. And finally, she said, taking a small breath, we will not erase the memory of her mother. Her portrait will not be taken down. Her favorite things will not be hidden away. If Alice ever wishes to speak of her, we will speak of her. We will honor her. A child cannot heal if she is forced to pretend she was never wounded. This was the last and most important condition. She was not there to be a replacement. She was there to help mend a broken heart, and that could not be done by pretending the first heart had never existed. Alexander stared at her. He had expected gratitude, perhaps some tearful acceptance. He had not expected this. He had not expected terms. He had not expected a woman with the courage to dictate the shape of her own role in his house, to demand respect not just for herself, but for his dead wife and his silent child. He had seen a quiet woman in a gray dress. He had not seen the spine of steel that held her up. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. It transformed his severe face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. "A Miss Ashworth," he said, and the formality of her name now sounded like a mark of profound respect. Your conditions are not only accepted, they are precisely what I should have asked for myself, had I the wisdom to think of them. Deep and irrevocable. He had offered her a position to solve a problem. But she, in her quiet, unbending dignity, had just offered him a partnership. When can you start?" he asked. "I will need to inform my uncle and cousins," she said. The thought of that confrontation was daunting, but for the first time, she felt armed for it. "We'll send a carriage for you tomorrow morning," he said. It was a statement. He would brook no interference from them. Mrs. Gable, my housekeeper, will have rooms prepared for you. That. He offered her his arm again. Now I believe we have been away from my other guests for long enough. Let us give them something new to whisper about." As they walked back toward the music and the laughter, Eleanor felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation unfurling in her chest. It was a feeling so foreign, she could barely put a name to it. It felt like hope. Harrowmere was as vast and beautiful as the stories claimed, a great beast of a house wrought from pale gold stone that seemed to have grown out of the rolling green hills. But inside, it was a house holding its breath. The magnificent halls were silent, the air still and cold, despite the summer day outside. Sunlight streamed through the tall arched windows, but it seemed only to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air, particles of a life that had been suspended. The portraits of generations of Harrowmere ancestors watched from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Eleanor's progress as the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, led her up the grand staircase. Mrs. Meadows. Gable was a tall, spare woman whose black silk dress rustled like dry leaves. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes, Eleanor noted, were kind. She was the ally Eleanor had not known she needed. "His Grace has given you the blue suite, Miss Ashworth," the housekeeper said, her voice low, as if she, too, were afraid of waking the sleeping house. It is in the family wing adjacent to the nursery." The suite was lovely, decorated in shades of pale blue and cream. With a fire already laid in the grate against the evening chill, a vase of fresh flowers, not white roses, Eleanor noticed, but a gentle mix of lavender and daisy sage stood on the mantelpiece. It was a room that had been prepared with thought. "His Grace said you were to want for nothing," Mrs. Gable said, her gaze steady, "and that we were to extend you every courtesy. You are not the new governess. You are Miss Alias's companion," she stressed the word, making it clear she understood the distinction. We have all been so worried for the little one." Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor said, her voice softer than she intended. "I will do my best not to be a burden. A house like this can bear the weight of one more soul." "Miss," the housekeeper replied with a flicker of a smile. "'Twas the silence that has been the heaviest burden of all." Later that afternoon, Eleanor was taken to the nursery. It was a large, airy room at the top of the house, with windows overlooking the gardens. It should have been a cheerful place, but it too felt muted and sad. The toys were neatly arranged on shelves, untouched. The rocking horse stood perfectly still, its painted eyes staring into the middle distance, and in a small chair by the window, a little girl sat with her back to the door. She was a small, delicate creature, with a cascade of dark hair, just like her father's, falling down her back. She did not turn when Eleanor and Mrs. Gable entered. She did not acknowledge their presence in any way. She was utterly still, clutching a small object in her hands. her attention fixed on the gardens below. "Alice, darling," a Mrs. Gable said softly. "Ah, this is Miss Ashworth. She has come to stay with us for a while." There was no response. The child did not move a muscle. Eleanor felt a wave of profound compassion wash over her. This was not a stubborn child. This was a child who had built a fortress of silence around her grief and was now trapped inside it. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor said quietly. You can leave us, eh?" The housekeeper hesitated, then gave a slight nod and retreated, closing the door softly behind her. Eleanor was alone with the silent child. She did not approach her. She did not try to coax a response. She remembered her own terms. And the Duca's weary admission that all the noise and forced cheer had only driven Alice deeper into herself. So Eleanor did the one thing no one else had thought to do. She shared the silence. She walked over to the other side of the room, pulled up a small armchair, and sat down. She took a book from her reticulae, slim volume of poetry, and opened it. She did not pretend to read, but actually read, letting the quiet rhythm of the words settle her own nerves. For an hour, they sat like that, two quiet islands in the silent room. The only sound was the rustle of a page turning, the distant call of a bird from the gardens. Eleanor did not look at Alice, but she was intensely aware of her, of the small, rigid set of her shoulders, the fierce grip she had on the object in her lap. Finally, as the light began to fade, Eleanor closed her book. She stood up and walked to the window, standing a few feet away from Alice's chair. The child still did not look at her. Eleanor looked out at the gardens, at the place where the formal lawns gave way to the wilder parkland. "It is a beautiful view," Eleanor said, her voice soft and conversational, as if she were merely talking to herself. "As so many different kinds of green. I never knew there could be so many." She waited. Nothing. When I was a girl," she went on, her voice a gentle murmur, "I had a book where I pressed flowers. My mother taught me how. You have to be very careful to lay them just so, between the pages, so they don't lose their shape. They lose their color, of course. A bright red poppy becomes a pale, papery ghost of itself. But it still remembers being a poppy." As she reached into her reticule and took out a small, worn leather book, she opened it to a page where a single, faded violet was pressed against the cream-colored paper. She did not show it to Alice. She simply held it. Still have it," she said. It has silly. I suppose a book of little ghosts." She turned and walked to the door. "A good night, Alice," she said softly. Before she left, she placed the open book, with its pressed violet, on a small table near the nursery door, where the child would have to see it if she ever chose to leave her chair. Then she went to her own room, her heart aching with the enormity of the task ahead, but with a flicker of conviction that this was the right path, the only path. The days that followed fell into a quiet routine. Every morning, Eleanor would go to the nursery. She would greet Alice, who never responded, and then she would settle into her chair with a book, or her sewing, or a sketchbook in which she began to draw the birds she saw from the window. She never demanded anything of the child. She never asked her questions. She knew she would not answer. She simply existed in the space with her, a calm, constant, and undemanding presence. She spoke to Alice, but in a way that did not require a reply. She would comment on the weather, or tell a brief story about a character in her book, or wonder aloud what the cook might be making for dinner. She filled the silence, not with noise, but with gentle, pointless words that hung in the air like dust motes, there to be observed or ignored. Alexander watched from a distance. He would see her from his study window, walking in the less frequented parts of the garden, her gray dress a familiar, soothing sight. He would listen outside the nursery door, hearing the low murmur of her voice and the profound, unbroken silence that answered it. Any other man would have lost patience. Any other man would have deemed the experiment a failure. But Alexander, a man who had lived in his own fortress of silence for 2 years, understood the slow, patient work of a siege. He had hired a companion for his daughter, but he found himself watching the companion with an intensity that unsettled him. He noticed the small things. He noticed that she always remembered to open the east-facing curtain in the nursery first, the one that caught the morning light his wife had loved. He noticed that she had mended a tear in the rocking horse's leather saddle, a detail the maids had overlooked for months. He noticed that when she spoke to Alice, she never used the cloying, sweet tones the other governesses had employed, but spoke to her as an equal. He began to find reasons to be in the parts of the house she frequented. He would pass her in the long gallery, ostensibly on his way to the library, and they would exchange a quiet greeting. The brief encounters were charged with an unspoken current. He was her employer, she his dependent, but the dynamic felt more complex than that. They were allies. They were two lonely people, bound by a shared desperate hope for a silent child. One afternoon he entered the nursery. It was the first time he had done so when Eleanor was there. She was sitting in her usual chair, sketching. Alice was in hers, staring out the window. The object she always held was, he now saw, a small, crudely carved wooden bird. A keepsake from her mother. Eleanor stood as he entered. Alice, for the first time, tensed, her small shoulders drawing in, as if his presence were an intrusion. The sight sent a pang of guilt through him. Forgive me, he said to Eleanor. I did not mean to disturb you. You are not disturbing us. Your Grace, she said. He walked to the window, his heart heavy. He felt like a clumsy giant in this delicate, quiet world she was building. Has there been any change? He asked, unable to keep the hope from his voice. She has not spoken, Eleanor said. But yesterday, she moved her chair. Just a few inches. Closer to the fire, it was the smallest of victories, but to Alexander it felt monumental. A shift of a few inches, a movement toward warmth. It was more progress than all the London doctors had achieved. Dow, and Eleanor added, her voice very low, she has been looking at the book. She indicated the small volume with the pressed flowers, which she now left open on a different page each day. Today it was a buttercup. Its yellow faded to a pale, ghostly cream. Alexander looked from the book to his daughter's back, and a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He had hired her out of a desperate, selfish impulse at a garden party, a whim born of recognizing a fellow prisoner. He had not truly believed she could succeed where all others had failed, but she was doing it. Not with tricks or expertise, but with a patience that was as deep and steady as the earth itself. A thank you, Eleanor, he said, and the use of her first name slipped out unbidden and natural. She did not correct him. She simply inclined her head, her expression calm. But he saw a faint blush rise on her cheeks. There is nothing to thank me for, Your Grace. I am only sitting. No, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You are waiting. There is a difference. He left the room, feeling as though the air inside had been warmer, lighter than the air in the rest of his house. The breakthrough, when it came, was as small and quiet as everything else in that nursery. A week later, Eleanor was sitting in her chair, humming a little tune under her breath as she mended a tear in one of Alias's dolls. It was a simple, rambling melody, a half-remembered lullaby from her own childhood. From across the room, there was a sound, a sharp intake of breath. Eleanor's hands froze on her needle. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on her work, but every nerve in her body was on high alert. She continued to hum, her voice barely a whisper. Alice turned her head. For the first time since Eleanor's arrival, she turned and looked directly at her. Her large, dark eyes, so like her father's, were wide, with a kind of startled wonder. She was not looking at Eleanor, but through her, as if listening to an echo. Eleanor finished the line of the melody and let it fade into silence. She did not speak. She did not move. She waited. Alice turned back to the window. It was over. But it was a beginning. That evening, Eleanor went to the music room, a chamber that had been locked since the Duchess's death. Gable, after a momentous hesitation, found the key for her. Inside, dust sheets covered the furniture like sleeping ghosts. Eleanor lifted the cover from the pianoforte. The keys were yellowed. She sat, and from memory, slowly, haltingly, picked out the melodies she had been humming. The next day, she did not hum it in the nursery. Instead, she left the door to the music room ajar and played it again, her touch more confident this time. She did not know if Alice could hear, but she played it anyway. 2 days later, as she sat with the child, Alice did something new. She got up from her chair, walked across the room to the table where Eleanor's book of pressed flowers lay, and pointed. Her small, pale finger rested on the image of a primrose. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She walked over and stood beside the child. "Ah, the primrose," she said, her voice calm and even. "Ah, it is one of the first flowers of spring, a sign that the winter is over." Alice looked up at her, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and went back to her chair. But she had crossed the room. She had pointed. She had communicated. The slow, patient thaw had begun. It continued in tiny, almost imperceptible increments. A glance held a second longer, a small nod in response to a direct, simple question. One afternoon, Eleanor was drawing a picture of a robin, and Alice came and stood behind her to watch, her presence a warm weight in the quiet room. The real crisis, and the real turning point, came with the autumn storms. The wind howled around the corners of the great house, and rain lashed against the windows. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of Harrowmere. Eleanor found Alice in the nursery, huddled in the farthest corner, her small body trembling. The wooden bird clutched to her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror. Eleanor did not hesitate. She went to the child, sat on the floor beside her, and pulled a thick woolen blanket from a nearby chest. She wrapped it around both of them, creating a small, warm tent. She did not speak. She simply held the trembling child against her side, a solid, warm presence in the roaring dark. When the thunder cracked again, directly overhead, Alice let out a small, terrified cry, her first sound in 2 years, and buried her face in Eleanor's dress. Eleanor held her tighter. "It is only noise," she whispered, her lips against the child's hair. It sounds angry, but it is just the sky stretching and yawning. It will be quiet again soon." She began to talk, her voice a low, steady murmur against the fury of the storm. She did not tell a story of brave knights or fearless princesses. She told a story about a little boat with a white sail that was afraid of the big dark waves. The little boat missed the quiet harbor where it used to be safe," Eleanor murmured. The harbor was always sunny and calm, and the water was always gentle. But one day, the little boat had to go out into the open sea, and a storm came. The waves were so big and the wind howled so loudly, the little boat thought it would be broken into 1,000 pieces. Alice was still listening, her small body still tense, but her trembling had lessened. But then the little boat remembered what the harbor master used to say. He would say that the sea is wide and wild, but that the boat was built to be strong, and that even in the biggest storm, if you just keep your sail pointed toward the light, you will find your way home. The harbor is always there, waiting for you. Even if you cannot see it, it remembers you, and it is waiting. She did not need to say that the boat was Alice, and the harbor was her mother. The child understood. Eleanor felt a single hot tear soak through the fabric of her sleeve. They sat like that for a long time, until the storm passed and the only sound was the gentle dripping of rain from the eaves. Alice did not pull away. She had fallen asleep, her breath soft and even, her face peaceful, for the first time in memory. Carefully, Eleanor lifted her into her arms. She was heavier than she looked. She carried her to her bed, tucked her in, and smoothed the dark hair from her forehead. When she turned, Alexander was standing in the doorway. He must have been there for some time, watching them. His face was a mask of warring emotions: pain, gratitude, a desperate, aching hope. He looked at his sleeping daughter, then at Eleanor. And his composure finally broke. He walked to the bed and touched his daughter's cheek with a trembling finger. "I heard her," he whispered. "I heard her cry out. She was frightened," Eleanor said softly. He looked at Eleanor, his gray eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Ah, you are a miracle, Miss Ashworth." "Ah no, Your Grace. I am just a woman who knows what it is to be afraid of storms." He gestured for her to follow him from the room, pulling the door almost closed behind them. In the hallway, lit by a single flickering lamp, he leaned against the wall as if his legs would no longer support him. "I have failed her," he said, his voice raw, "her own father. And I did not know how to comfort her. I filled this house with experts and authorities, and all she needed was quiet. All she needed was for someone to sit with her in the dark." "You did not fail her," Eleanor said, her heart aching for him. "You were grieving." "You cannot draw water from an empty well, Your Grace," an earned aphorism, spoken softly. "Call me Alexander," he said, pushing himself away from the wall. Please." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "I find I do not wish for there to be any more formality between us than is absolutely necessary." "Ah, Alexander," she repeated, the name feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. They stood in the quiet hallway, the sleeping child in the room behind them, the spent storm outside. A new intimacy had been forged between them in the darkness, a bond of shared vulnerability and profound unspoken gratitude. The cold house of Harrowmere did not feel quite so cold anymore. A fire had been lit, a child had been held, a name had been spoken, and for the first time, Eleanor felt that she was not just a companion or an employee. She was home. But warmth invites the cold to rush in, and happiness is a magnet for those who would see it destroyed. The quiet progress at Harrowmere had not gone unnoticed. Whispers that had started at the garden party had grown, fed by the fertile malice of Lavinia and Cecily. The poor relation, the little gray mouse, was living in the Duque's own house, in the family wing, no less. She had inveigled her way into his confidence, preying on his grief. She was an adventuress of the worst sort. The whispers finally reached the ears of someone with the power to act on them, Lady Danbury, a cousin of the late Duchess. She was a formidable woman, a dragon of propriety, who saw it as her solemn duty to guard the family's reputation and, more importantly, the well-being of the motherless child. Fueled by Lavinia's carefully crafted letters, full of feigned concern for poor dear Allier being left in the care of an unstable, grasping young woman, Lady Danbury announced her intention to visit Harrowmere and assess the situation for herself. Her arrival was like a blast of Arctic air. She was a tall, imposing woman in severe black bombazine, her face set in lines of permanent disapproval. She swept into Harrowmere, as if taking possession of a fortress under siege, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She was polite to Eleanor, but with a chilling civility that was more insulting than open hostility. She referred to her as a Don Persona, and addressed her questions not to Eleanor herself, but to Mrs. Gable, or even to Alexander in Eleanor's presence, as if she were a piece of furniture. "And what are the young person's qualifications for this role?" she asked Alexander over dinner on her first night. Her gaze fixed on a point over Eleanor's head. "A Miss Ashworth's qualification," Alexander replied, his voice dangerously smooth. "Odds, that my daughter is sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. That is sufficient for me." Lady Danbury was not so easily deterred. She began a campaign of observation. She would appear silently in the nursery doorway, watching Eleanor and Alice with an unnerving stillness. She tried to engage Alice directly, her voice a sharp, commanding tool. "Come now, child. This silence is morbid. Your mother would have wanted you to be a happy, chattering girl. Tell me what your companion has been teaching you." Her efforts only made Alice retreat further, her small body growing rigid, her face turning once more to the window, the wooden bird held in a white-knuckled grip. Eleanor felt the pressure mounting. Lady Danburia's presence was a constant draining weight. She saw the woman's skepticism in every glance, heard her disapproval in every clipped question. She began to fear that this fragile piece she had built would be shattered, that she would be sent away, and Alice would be left to the mercy of those who saw her silence as a defect to be corrected rather than a wound to be healed. The climax of Lady Danburia's campaign came a week after her arrival. She announced she was hosting a small, intimate dinner, a chance, she said, for dear Elias's welfare to be discussed among family. The guest list was small and pointed. Alexander, Eleanor, and, to Eleanor's sinking horror, her cousins, Lavinia and Cecily. They arrived in a flurry of silks and scents, their eyes glittering with triumphant malice. They greeted Eleanor with an exaggerated affection that was painful to watch. Eleanor, darling, you look so well. Country air must agree with you, Lavinia trilled, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's simple, dark blue gown, a stark contrast to her own fashionable chartreuse creation. The dinner was an ordeal. Lady Danbury steered the conversation, with subtle help from the cousins, toward the topic of unsuitable companions and the vulnerability of grieving men. The air was thick with insinuation. Then Lavinia, under the guise of fond reminiscence, delivered the blow she had been planning all along. "Oh, we were always so protective of Eleanor, you know, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She looked at Lady Danbury, then at Alexander. She was always such a sensitive child, prone to melancholy. There was a time, after her dear father passed, when she had a rather serious nervous affliction. She would hide for days at a time. We were so worried for her mind. A quiet girl has a troubled mind." The lie was breathtaking in its cruelty. It was a distortion of a simple truth. After her father's death, the heartbroken, grieving Eleanor had sought solace in her uncle's vast, unused library, losing herself in books for hours at a time. Her cousins, who never read, had interpreted her absence as a strange and morbid withdrawal. Now, they had twisted that memory into a weapon. The room went silent. The accusation hung in the air, shimmering and venomous. An unstable mind, unfit to be near a child, prone to melancholy. It was the perfect, unprovable slander. Lady Danbury looked from Lavinia's concerned face to Eleanor's pale one, a look of grim vindication on her features. She had her proof. Alexander, who had been sitting perfectly still at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, slowly placed his wineglass on the table. The small click echoed in the silent room. He turned his head and looked at Eleanor. His face was a cold, hard mask, his gray eyes impossible to read. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a judge's sentence. "Is this true?" This was the moment, the precipice. Everything she had built, the trust she had earned, the fragile hope she had dared to feel, it all balanced on this single point in time. She could feel the four of the mere cousins, Lady Danbury, Alexander, watching her, waiting for her to crumble. She lifted her chin. She did not look at her tormentors. She looked only at Alexander, holding his gaze across the long, polished expanse of the dining table. "Ah, no, Your Grace," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant as a bell. "Ah, it is not." She then turned her head, very slowly, and looked at Lavinia. For the first time she met her cousin's gaze with something other than patient endurance. She met it with cold, clear-eyed truth. Lavinia, you are mistaken," she said, her tone level, almost conversational. "I was not hiding. I was in the library. I was reading. You simply did not think to look for me there." Ah, the simplicity of it was devastating. It did not argue. It did not defend. It simply stated a fact. And in doing so, it exposed the lie for the shabby, malicious thing it was. It painted a picture, not of a troubled girl, but of two ignorant ones, and a third who found solace in a world they could not be bothered to enter. Lavinia's face, which had been a mask of sweet concern, crumpled. A flush of angry red crept up her neck. Oh, well, we were worried. It was not natural. Alexander had heard enough. He turned his cool, assessing gaze, the gaze of a man who could ruin a family with a single word, upon Lavinia and Cecily. My daughter," he began, his voice dangerously soft, was trapped in a silence that no doctor in London could penetrate. "In the months Miss Ashworth has been here, Alice has begun to live again. I have seen her tend to the flowers in the nursery. I have heard her hum a melody. I have seen her smile. Your sudden, pressing concern for my daughter's welfare," he continued, his eyes like chips of ice, "seems to have arrived somewhat late, and is based on information of a questionable accuracy." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "A cruelty seems already abundant this evening. I see no reason to add mine." He picked up his wine-glass. The carriage is waiting to take you home. Ladies, it was not a suggestion, it was an execution. A social beheading, performed with the clean, cold efficiency of a guillotine. Lavinia and Cecily, their faces pale with shock and fury, rose from the table. They did not look at Eleanor. They could not. They mumbled their farewells to a silent Lady Danbury and were escorted from the room. The battle was won, but the war for Alicia's heart and for Elenia's place in this house was decided the very next day, not in a dining room full of malice, but in the quiet of the garden. Eleanor, emotionally exhausted, had sought refuge near the enclosure of white roses. She stood by the low stone wall, breathing in their faint, sweet scent, trying to calm the tremor in her hands. She had won, but she felt hollowed out. Wounded by the sheer venom of the attack, she heard a small sound behind her. She turned. It was Alice. She had come out of the great house by herself, something Eleanor had never seen her do. She walked slowly, hesitantly across the grass, her eyes fixed on Eleanor. In her small hand, she clutched something. She stopped a few feet away. Her face was solemn, her dark eyes huge. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a single, perfect, freshly picked, white rose. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Alice had gone into the neglected garden, her mother's garden, the garden she had avoided for 2 years. Alice took another step forward and pushed the rose into Eleanor's hand. Her small fingers were cold. Then she looked up, her gaze meeting Eleanor's directly, and she spoke. Her voice was a small, rusty whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had ever heard. "Ah, for Mama," she said, her gaze flicking toward the sky. Then she looked back at Eleanor, her expression one of utter trusting gravity. And for you, eh?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring the image of the child's earnest face. She knelt, heedless of the damp grass on her dress, and wrapped her arms around Aliasa's small warm body. Alice, after a momentous hesitation, put her arms around Eleanor's neck and held on tight. From a window in the house, 2 figures watched. Alexander, his heart so full he felt it might burst, and beside him, Lady Danbury. She watched the woman and the child clinging to each other in the garden, and the hard righteous certainty on her face finally crumbled. She saw not an adventuress and her victim, but 2 survivors finding solace in each other. She left that afternoon, her farewell to Eleanor quiet, and for the first time respectful. The silence she left behind was not empty, it was peaceful. That evening, Alexander found Eleanor in the library. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the book-lined walls. She was standing by the window, looking out into the moonlit darkness, the white rose tucked into the sash of her dress. He came and stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. The air between them was thick with all the things that had been won, and all the things that had been lost. "I was a fool," he said at last, his voice rough. "I invited the world to a garden party when my own garden was dying from neglect. I was so consumed by my own grief, I did not see I was letting my daughter drown in hers. It was a confession of a kind she had never expected to hear from him. A raw admission of failure. "I asked you to come here as a companion for my daughter," he went on, turning to face her. The firelight carved his face into stark lines of shadow and gold. He was no longer the Duke of Harrowmere. He was just a man. He was Alexander, that was a lie. Or, at least, it was only half the truth, I think. Even then, I knew I was the one who needed the companion. He reached out and gently touched the white rose at her waist. His fingers brushed her hand, and a jolt of warmth shot through her. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and intense. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in the rain of my ridiculous party, refusing to be bowed by it." Eleanor's heart soared, but her old cautious self threw up one last defense. She had been useful. She had been a miracle worker. She had saved his child. Gratitude was a powerful emotion, but it was not love. "Ah, Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I do not say it if it is only gratitude. For, Aliasa, for what I have done, I could not bear it if it were only that." He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his lips. He took her hands in his grip warm and firm. When I first saw you," he said, his gray eyes searching hers, I did not seek out a woman in a gray dress because I pitied her. I sought her out because in a garden full of color and noise, she was the only person who looked real." He lifted one of her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Alice is the heart of this house. You, Eleanor, you, taught it how to beat again. It is not gratitude. I feel it is a resurrection." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was clumsy and honest and desperate. A kiss full of 2 years of loneliness and a few short months of dawning, impossible hope. It was the kiss of a man coming home after a long, long journey in the dark. Eleanor melted against him, her fears and doubts dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. She was not a quiet girl in a quiet color. She was not a poor relation or a useful companion. She was loved. 6 months later, spring had returned to Harrowmere. It was not just in the daffodils that carpeted the lawns or the tender green leaves that unfurled on the trees. It was inside the house, too. The great halls, once so cold and silent, now echoed with the sound of a child's laughter. The dust sheets were gone. Fires burned brightly in the grates, and sunlight streamed through sparkling clean windows. In the long gallery, the portrait of the late Duchess still hung in its place of honor. Sometimes, a little girl with dark hair and a woman with kind eyes would place a small vase of fresh white roses on the table beneath it. The memory was not erased, it was honored, woven into the fabric of the new life that was blooming all around it. Lavinia and Cecily were no longer received at Harrowmere, or at any of the other great houses in the county. They had been rendered, by one Manas, quiet, authority, irrelevant. They had become the very thing they had always feared being invisible. One bright April afternoon, Alexander walked out into the gardens. He found them, as he so often did, in the small, enclosed garden of white roses. The space had been transformed, the weeds were gone, the soil turned, the bushes pruned and thriving. It was a place of serene, living beauty. Eleanor was kneeling on the ground, her hands in the rich earth, showing Alice how to settle a new rose bush into the soil. She was not wearing gray, or even a respectable dark blue. She was wearing a gown the soft, clear color of the spring sky, and her face, upturned to the sun, was luminous with happiness. She was no longer a flower pressed between the pages of a book. She was planted, rooted, gloriously alive. Alexander stopped and watched them, his heart full. He had sought out a shadow in his garden, a quiet woman in a quiet color, hoping she could bring a flicker of life back to his silent child. But Eleanor Ashworth was not a shadow. She was the one who stayed, and she had brought the sun with her. What do you think is the truest form of kindness? The grand gesture, or the quiet act of simply staying? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your favorite moment of Eleanor and Alexander's story was. If you enjoyed their journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love against the odds. We love reading your reactions and knowing where our stories are finding a home around the world. We will have another tale for you very soon. Until then, take care.